you so much for having me join you. It's really a pleasure to be with you today, and to listen to the other speakers is really exciting. I'm going to be talking with you about our perspective on housing from a disability vantage point, and how the lack of affordable and accessible housing denies individuals with disabilities their civil right to live in the most integrated setting, and how individuals are therefore forced into institutions, homelessness, jails, all congregate settings. People with disabilities have very low incomes, and as a consequence face a threat of eviction. And when they become homeless, it can take them many years to become housed. For people with no disability, it may take a matter of months or a year. But if you have a disability and you've become homeless, it can take quite a long time, quite a number of years. The current crisis in housing is worsened by the pandemic, and it is forcing people with chronic health conditions and disabilities that place them at higher risk into the risk of losing their housing because they're not able to work and they have additional expenses for their living. It puts them at higher risk of ending up in congregate facilities where they will, of course, be at significantly higher risk of contracting the virus and because of their risk of dying. Why is this happening? Employment for people with disabilities hovers around 30%, at least in New York City, not so different across the nation. But the employment rate for people who are Black and have disabilities is only around 20%. And for people who are Latinx or Asian American, the employment rate is only around 16%. As you can see, these employment rates create the precondition for a very, very high level of poverty. And so the poverty rate, living under 100% of the federal poverty level, which is desperately poor, for people with disabilities, about 31% of us live under the federal poverty rate. That's higher for people who are Black, and particularly high for people who are Latino, Latina, at 43% of people living under the federal poverty level. If you look at very low income people who are maybe at 200% of the federal poverty level, you find that more than 50% of people with disabilities are living on these very low incomes. And of course, that is increased. The numbers are increased when you look at race and ethnicity and discrimination based on race and ethnicity as it affects people's ability to earn a living. People with disabilities therefore face a particularly greater housing burden, we call it, meaning difficulty affording housing and paying more of your income for housing. We find that about more than half of people with disabilities in our city pay more than a third of their income on rent, and an additional 36% spend more than half of their income on rent. And that makes it very difficult to remain stably housed, and makes it important to have extremely low income housing or housing subsidies that are sufficient, and makes it very difficult for people to avoid becoming homeless, and they have a substantial risk of infection. Our social services agency in the city, which operates our homeless shelter system for more than 70,000 people in New York City, hired a research firm, and they came back and told us that more than 60% of people living in homeless shelters have disabilities of varying kinds. And this is important because the homeless shelter system is entirely inaccessible and does not provide accommodations for people with disabilities at present. which is why we brought them to court and negotiated a settlement agreement that's now in implementation to force these changes to finally occur. But it means also that many people with disabilities are currently living on the streets or living in institutions. More than 55,000 people with disabilities of different ages are now living in nursing facilities in New York City. It is directly linked for many of them to the absolute dearth of affordable housing and the infinitesimal rate of affordable housing that is also accessible. It's less than 3%.